February 23, 1945. In a concrete bunker beneath Mount Suribachi, a young Japanese soldier put pen to paper and wrote words that would have cost him his life had his officers found them. The Marines are not human. They do not die like other men. What he recorded that night would echo across every island in the Pacific, a simple, terrible conclusion. Modern war had married spirit to industry, and the result was a force Japan could not defeat. February 23, 1945. Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto crouched in a cramped concrete bunker. His hand trembled as he wrote into a battered notebook, sketching not maps or orders, but astonishment and fear. Through a narrow firing slit, he had watched men arrive as if driven by a single iron will. 6 Marines had stormed his position beneath a hail of machine gun fire. 3 fell instantly, the others continued. When a Japanese grenade barrage tore through their line, one Marine took the blast upon his own body to shield his comrades, and grievously wounded, he kept fighting until his arms could no longer hold his rifle. Within minutes, the surviving attackers had seized the emplacement. Around the island, 21,000 Japanese soldiers occupied an intricate network of defenses, almost 18 kilometers of tunnels, caves, and reinforced positions prepared by officers who had been taught one thing above all: that the American invader was soft, that he would break under pressure. What those defenders encountered instead shattered every assumption ingrained in Imperial Army doctrine. The miscalculation was not an error in maps or supply charts. It was written in the calculus of close-quarters combat. In 36 days of fighting, the Marines suffered roughly 26,000 casualties, but their advance did not falter. It only hardened. The collapse of Japanese confidence, however, had not begun at Iwo Jima. It had been growing quietly across years and islands. On August 7, 1942, at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, Corporal Hideo Takahashi, a veteran of the China campaign, where Japanese forces had previously fought with almost unassailable success, made an entry in his diary that would be repeated in many forms afterward. The Americans who landed are different from any enemy we have faced. They do not retreat when surrounded. They do not surrender when their position becomes hopeless. Most disturbing, they fight at night, as if darkness gives them strength rather than fear. Guadalcanal was Japan's first large-scale defensive campaign in the Pacific. The Imperial General Staff expected to meet inexperienced, poorly led opponents. Instead, they met a Marine division of just over 16,000 men who refused to behave like the adversary Japan had known. Lieutenant Shigeru Fukudome commanded a reinforced company ordered to retake Henderson Field on the night of August 20th. His 200 men advanced in textbook formation, confident the Americans would panic in darkness. They walked into a killing ground. The Marines, waiting in prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, counterattacked into the night with automatic weapons and precision that defied Japanese expectations. Fukudome's company was reduced to 90 men. American casualties numbered a fraction of that. Fukudome's diary, recovered after his death 3 days later, read plainly, "They attacked us in the night. We are the ones who attack at night." The pattern repeated. Japanese troops who had once watched their enemies collapse beneath banzai charges discovered instead opponents who held ground until physically overrun, then fought back at point-blank range with bayonets, knives, and fists. Sergeant Kenji Matsumoto, who served 4 months on Guadalcanal before evacuation, wrote in a letter that fell into Allied hands, "We were taught the Americans are individualistic, that they will not sacrifice for their comrades. This is false. I watched a Marine machine gunner continue firing with both legs shattered until Japanese infantry killed him at arm's length. His assistant immediately took the weapon and continued. That single position cost Matsumoto's unit 40 men. Japanese military analysts were perplexed. The training that produced such soldiers did not fit their model of American society, and yet it produced fighters who resembled Japanese warriors in their readiness to endure and die. Private Yamamoto, who would later face Marines on Iwo Jima, first learned of this phenomenon in intelligence briefings during 1943. A staff officer who had interrogated captured Marines described their training as something akin to criminal abuse in the eyes of many, recruits broken down mentally and physically, then rebuilt into combatants conditioned to view death in service as honorable and surrender as shameful. The Japanese observers recognized echoes of their own Bushido. What they had not expected was the Americans' industrial advantage. That combination proved devastating. Japanese soldiers, steeped in the code of sacrifice, increasingly fought with equipment inferior to American weapons and without the logistical depth to replace losses. American Marines, disciplined and hardened by rigorous training, arrived with tanks, flamethrowers, overwhelming artillery, air support, and lines of supply that never ceased. At Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, Rear Admiral Kiichiro Shibasaki's 4,500 defenders had been told their fortifications were impregnable. In 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division proved otherwise. Private First Class Tadashi Ogawa, one of only 17 survivors, told interrogators what he had seen. The first wave was massacred in the water. We killed hundreds. More craft arrived. The second wave died on the beach. More came. The third wave reached our positions with flamethrowers. They did not stop until we were dead or they were. The arithmetic was brutal. Thousands dead in days, and the Marines continued. Captured documents and post-battle intelligence from Saipan and elsewhere categorized the Marines as, in effect, shock troops. Units that refused orders to withdraw, that counterattacked even when tactically disadvantaged, and whose casualties did not degrade unit effectiveness until the unit was nearly destroyed. Captain Yoshio Kobayashi, a Guadalcanal survivor, drew comparisons that set alarm bells ringing in high command. American Army infantry were professional and conventional. The Marines operated differently, aggressively and relentlessly, often accepting casualty rates that would halt other forces. Speed and initiative were as lethal as firepower. Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, responsible for defenses on Peleliu, had planned based on prior campaigns in which American forces paused after costly landings. The Marines did not pause. They landed on September 15th at 8:30 and controlled much of the island's airfield by nightfall. Nakagawa's diary recorded blunt astonishment. My defensive plan collapsed because it assumed the enemy would act rationally. The Marines do not act rationally. They act with total commitment regardless of circumstances. To Japanese officers, this behavior appeared suicidal. To Marine commanders, it was disciplined calculation, an accepted price of manpower traded for speed and decisive results. One textbook episode describes a Marine platoon charging across open ground swept by 3 bunkers' machine gun fire. Japanese doctrine would have demanded artillery preparation and smoke cover before such an assault. The Marine lieutenant assessed the objective for 30 seconds, ordered the attack, and the platoon charged. 7 men were hit in the first 20 seconds. The survivors reached the first bunker, destroyed it with grenades and demolition charges, and continued to the next. The entire action, from order to completion, consumed no more than 4 minutes. The platoon suffered 12 casualties from 37 men, but took a position previously deemed impregnable. This was not raw bravado. It was the systematic application of acceptable losses to achieve operational tempo. That concept, acceptable casualties, horrified many Japanese commanders trained to preserve lives within their operational calculus. Faced with enemies who would accept 50% losses to seize a position, Japanese leaders confronted impossible choices: either thinly defend many points and lose them, or concentrate forces and risk collapse elsewhere. Major Yoshi Takahori, a staff officer who survived Iwo Jima, later explained in interrogation that their defenses were designed to delay and exact the maximum cost. "We calculated that inflicting 10,000 casualties would halt their advance for at least a week," he observed. "They suffered 10,000 in the first week, and their advance never slowed." The imbalance was structural. America could replace losses, Japan could not. Logistics compounded the problem. Marines landed with a sea of support: ammunition, medical stores, mobile kitchens, rest areas, and rotating units. Second Lieutenant Toshio Yamamoto, captured on Saipan, led a patrol 3 days after the landings, expecting to find exhausted invaders. Instead, he found troops eating hot food, receiving fresh ammunition, and resting between rotations. Supply dumps held more rounds than his entire regiment. The relentless American logistics transformed battle into attrition in favor of the attacker. As time passed, defenders weakened while attackers grew stronger. Tactics evolved accordingly. Marine raiders and specialized units demonstrated the devastating effect of small mobile formations conducting night infiltration and close raids. Colonel Kono Ichiki's force encountered such tactics on Guadalcanal in August 1942 with disastrous results. 900 men walked into an ambush, and casualties mounted in the hundreds. Raiders' innovations, night patrols, independent small unit action, delegated decision-making spread into regular Marine doctrine, making the enemy effective round the clock. Japanese units, used to exploiting the night since they previously held that advantage, found no respite. The nature of modern combined arms became painfully clear. When a bunker resisted infantry, artillery rained shells. When earthworks remained, tanks with flamethrowers burned them out. When engineers could not reach, naval gunfire erased terrain. Lieutenant Saburo Endo, an artillery forward observer on Saipan, recorded that warships shelled positions for hours before troops hit the beaches. Aircraft bombed for additional hours, and then coordinated land forces finished the work. The Marines fought like a machine. Riflemen fixed the enemy, machine guns suppressed, mortars delivered smoke, artillery destroyed fortifications, tanks moved forward, and aircraft struck targets unreachable by ground fire. Coordination, speed, and delegated initiative made this system more than the sum of its parts. The most feared instrument in many Japanese soldiers' minds was not a rifle or a bayonet, but the flamethrower. Trained to accept death in battle as a form of glory, many found death by flame, the smell, the screaming, the smell of burning flesh, to be an ignoble and torturous end. Corporal Hideo Takahashi, returned from Okinawa with severe burns, testified later to the psychological horror of flame. For many, it destroyed the concept of the honorable death they had been taught to accept. By 1944, the lesson had become textbook for Japanese intelligence. Captured reports circulated through garrisons, blunt in tone and without hope. They advised commanders not to expect American withdrawals, not to assume casualties would break enemy courage, and to plan defensive in depth with redundant positions and fallback lines. The objective was no longer to win, but to inflict maximum casualties to slow the advance and, perhaps, change political calculations far from the battlefield. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, charged with defending Iwo Jima, understood the arithmetic fully. He forbade banzai charges that had previously wasted lives, and instead built a defense of caves and tunnels, interlocking fields of fire, and reserved artillery calibrated to make every landing costly. "This is a mathematical problem with only one solution," he wrote in a letter. "They will bring unlimited supplies. We cannot defeat them. We can only make them pay for every meter." His strategy accepted the inevitable fall of ground in hopes of imposing a cost high enough to influence the enemy's political will. What Japanese defenders discovered in practice was the most dangerous possible combination. Men with the ferocity and cohesion of warrior culture, trained to die if necessary, fused with an industrial state capable of replacing losses, supplying equipment, and sustaining offensive tempo. Private Yamamoto's final diary entry, written the night before his death, captured the bleak clarity of that realization. The Marines will win not because they are braver than we are. They will win because their nation gives them everything they need to win. And they will use those resources without mercy until we are all dead. The bunker that held him collapsed the next day under a Marine demolition assault that killed every defender. The demolition teams moved on, as did the campaign across the Pacific. By March 26th, the Iwo Jima operation had exacted immense tolls. 21,000 Japanese dead, only a few hundred taken prisoner, and nearly 26,000 Marine casualties from 70,000 assaulting troops, figures so severe that any other army might have been broken. Yet the Marines reconstituted. Units withdrawn to refit were replaced. Divisions returned to the line within weeks. The capacity to absorb punishment and continue to press forward became the defining characteristic most feared by Japanese officers. After the war, interrogation reports and veteran testimony converged on a single assessment. The Marines were not supernatural. They were a deliberately forged instrument. Training that instilled cohesion and sacrifice. Tactical doctrine that delegated initiative to the lowest levels, a logistical system that sustained high-tempo operations and the industrial base to replace human and material losses. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized glorious death as an end, the Americans transformed willingness to die into a disciplined means, and they paired that discipline with the means to continue fighting. For many former Japanese soldiers, the post-war revelation was devastating. Where propaganda had taught them the enemy to be weak and corrupt, the reality proved otherwise. The Americans treated prisoners humanely, provided care, and fed the defeated, conduct that broke the last illusions. Veterans who returned home reconciled too late with a harsher truth. Spirit without supply is not enough. Courage alone could not overturn the structural advantages of an industrialized opponent who had learned to harness both will and means. The statistical record is stark. Marines fought in every major Pacific campaign, from Guadalcanal in 1942 to Okinawa in 1945. Their casualty totals numbered in the tens of thousands, with nearly 20,000 killed. Yet objectives were taken, islands seized, and defensive lines broken. The cost was obscene and real. The results were absolute. The lesson the Japanese soldiers recorded in diaries, interrogation reports, and whispered confessions after the war endures as a sobering truth about modern war. An army's spirit must be matched by logistics, technology, and doctrine. When a nation can field both, and is willing to pay the price, it becomes an almost unstoppable force. Private Yamamoto's last words remain a haunting epitaph. We are samurai fighting with swords against men with machine guns who also have the spirit of samurai. There was never any hope. There was only death. History records strategy and statistics, but it is in the diaries and the bunkers that we find the human reckoning. Across the Pacific, men on both sides testified to courage and suffering. The Marines' combination of training, material, and will reshaped the outcome of the war, and, in so doing, reshaped the world that came after. The islands they took stand as monuments to sacrifice. The lessons they taught remain warnings about the terrible efficiencies of modern conflict. If this exploration of the Pacific campaigns and the grim arithmetic of modern warfare resonated with you, please consider subscribing. It helps us continue to bring carefully researched, narrated history to the channel.